Hello, I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropocene. The scene is set. A beautiful roadside meadow, the summer air circulating calmly around you, lightly rolling tongues of soft warmth lick over your shoulders. The wafting scent of the meadow forbs draws you into the herbaceous waves flowing from a soft breeze. Large fireworks of pink dot the meadow green. You pick one. A white latex begins to ooze over your fingers. Broken from the trance, you realize the monotony of species, floral repetition. Milky, broadleaf plants standing strong in an alien habitat, bringing about an ecological shift that may destroy some ecosystems, but could potentially save others. And what's up, nerds? Welcome to another episode of the Anthropocene podcast, led by me and all of my boundless energy. How are you doing today, Kirsten?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking. I think I have a little less energy than you, but I am excited to be here.
I think if we both had this amount of energy in every episode, it would be very difficult to listen to. I think we need the counterbalance between our two personalities to make this as successful as we want it to be.
Overwhelming.
Cool. So it's a bit of a cheat question, but do you know what we're talking about today? Because I don't think I've necessarily described it as well as some other episodes where the intro is like pretty indicative of very specific species.
Well, it's a plant and it has flowers.
Mmm.
And it's creamy?
Creamy.
It's super creamy. Almost. Yeah. That's the adjective I would have used. So we are talking about the Apocynaceae family, or the dogbanes. We're going to get a little bit more into specifics because we are focusing on one species, and I still haven't necessarily been clear on what we're talking about, but I kind of want to make it a surprise for as long as possible. So people have to listen.
A creamy
So
surprise.
Apocynaceae, yeah. So I mean, I guess they'll kind of know by the title. But anyway,
Right.
Apocynaceae consists of the milkweeds, of which there are many species. There's also trees, shrubs, and vines. So dogbanes, in a very general sense, are so called because there are a few species that are quite highly toxic to dogs. I did see one specific reference to something where it was actively used to poison dogs, but every official source and cited source that I saw for the name just said it was dogbane because it's toxic to dogs, not that it was necessarily used specifically to poison dogs, though who knows. There is a somewhat recent reclassification of the former family Asclepidaceae into the Apocynaceae family. So if you know Asclepus, the genus, then you know that we are talking about milkweeds. So the milkweeds are now a subfamily of Apocynaceae, which is Asclepioidea. So it's the genus for a lot of milkweeds is Asclepias. So let's get really specific about what species we're talking about here. We are talking about, of course, common milkweed, or Asclepias syriaca. Now, I will probably not say this many more times because syriaca, for some reason, is something that my mouth refuses to form properly in quick succession. So if you're listening and you have any background in etymology, then you might recognize the syriaca epithet, which is implying that the plant is from Syria, which is an easy way to remember that. Of course, you can chalk that up to Daddy Linnaeus, who believed that this species originated in Syria, which of course we know today to be completely incorrect. Carl Linnaeus is Daddy Linnaeus, for those of you who may not be well versed in species discovery and categorization. So let's get specific and describe this species to you. It's not going to be as clear as maybe some of the animal or other more notable plant species that we describe in the future, but I would say that milkweed, especially common milkweed, does have a pretty unique look to it that does make it stand out from other species that it may be growing around. So Common milkweed grows about 3 to 4 feet tall. I've seen it taller. Some places may cite it as growing shorter. It's obviously going to vary based on the soil structure, the available nutrients, and just available sunlight and things like that. 3 to 4 feet, of course, is 1 to 1.2 meters for those of you not using freedom units. I thank you, by the way. Eventually, we will get the US to switch over. It has relatively large leaves with very pretty prominent pink to light red veins that run through them. In the more juvenile stage of the plants, the veins aren't necessarily that pink, and even in some adult plants, they don't show, but there is a pretty significant difference in the veination coloration variation. Wow, that was a lot. That was a mouthful, wasn't it? So the leaves are of opposite positioning, which essentially means that they're equally placed on either side of the stem. Alternating would be if a leaf did not have another leaf directly parallel to it on the other side. So opposite is just like it sounds. The leaves are equidistant from each other on the stem. Now, each opposite leaf group alternates orientation up the stem, kind of a rotational symmetry. So you'll have two opposite leaves pointing, for example, north and south, and then above that, east and west. And then, from that, it doesn't directly correlate to the directions. I'm just using this as an example for you to get a better visual. So the most notable part of these plants, or these flowers in general, is the large pink flower heads that look like just big, huge pink balls. And I want to just take a quick second and a quick aside to acknowledge the fact that I am fully aware of this reoccurring trend that I have about talking about balls. And I assure you, as much as you might not believe it, it is unintentional. It might be subconscious, but it is not a conscious decision on my part. So, sorry, I'm not sorry.
The first step to recovery is acknowledgement, Nicholas.
Right, but that would be assuming that I have a problem and that balls are a problem, which they are not.
I like you. You have balls. I like balls.
The balls do cause a lot of problems, but I think that's an episode better covered in a completely different podcast. Anyway, so if you think of these big giant umbels of flowers, umbels are essentially like flower clusters where each individual little floret is kind of on a little stalk and they grow together to form a larger flower. Well, the umbels on common milkweed are so large that they essentially are weighted down by how large they are, and they form essentially these big pink arcing ball shapes. So imagine almost like I described in the intro, a firework of explosive pink. When you see the big exploding fireworks and they have those little dots around them, it's essentially the same thing. You can also pad my wonderful description of flowers by just a cursory Google search. I promise you, it's probably more underwhelming than I am giving it credit. But either way.
May I just note that umbels may be my new favorite word.
It's better than balls, that's for sure.
Hey, I'm not judging your favorite word, Nicholas.
Hey, if we ever have merch, it's just going to say balls in lowercase letters with a period after it, and the back will say Anthropocene Podcast, and people will have to ask about it because of context. Donate now for us to release the first issue of ball merch by the Anthropocene Podcast. This episode brought to you by balls. and probably every subsequent episode if we continue this trend, which I will now. Of course, the species and the genus and all of the other dogbanes and things like that are generally called milkweed for very obvious reasons. If the plant is damaged in any way, then a milky latex oozes out, a creamy surprise, as Kirsten so eloquently put it earlier. It's pretty sticky and it varies in toxicity based on the species, but ultimately it makes it very difficult for many species of insects to predate it. You could refer to this as forbidden marshmallow fluff, if you will. In my experience, it's incredibly sticky. It's akin to the herpers that I know are listening to when you pick up a slimy salamander and no matter what you do, water won't wash it off, and you have to use a very specific aggregate to clean off the sliminess, which is ironically sticky.
Slimy? It's satisfying.
And it's annoying. It's incredibly annoying. And if you're in a field walking through them, every part of the plant oozes this out in like relatively impressive quantities. I mean, it's not shooting out. Like, it's not the only visual representation that I can compare it to is wildly inappropriate for the contents of this podcast. But just imagine like a thick white oozing substance slowly leaking out from the tip of a leaf or from the base of a flower stem. Honestly, anywhere you pick it, with the exception of parts of the flowers, it oozes out.
Oh, that's nasty.
Okay,
So
question from me, who's hasn't seen a lot of milkweed. So obviously it's protecting a little bit from the insects. Do they get stuck in there as well?
it doesn't necessarily affect larger insects because it doesn't come out in large enough quantities, but there are a lot of smaller insects like gnats and things like that that I imagine would get stuck in this oozy latex type stuff. So yeah, it could have a negative effect in insects in that way.
Hmm.
So yes, there are a lot of insects that cannot utilize this plant for eating or for reproductivity or things like that because of this sticky protection that it has. However, there are, of course, several exceptions. There are specific milkweed species, but there is one very famous one that we will be talking about, and that is, of course, the monarch butterfly. So monarch butterflies use this species both to lay their eggs on and ultimately ingest in their large larval forms. They're not just using it for protection of their eggs, they are ingesting it. And this does bioaccumulate in them and make them toxic to predators, both in their larval, pupal, and adult forms. So they can't be predated upon, which is a very good use of this plant and really cool symbiotic relationship between the two. I don't know if it's necessarily symbiosis, but I'm too lazy to
Well,
think of
yes,
the actual proper comparison.
you'd be symbiotic, but it wouldn't necessarily be commensalism, or
It'd be
mutualism. Sorry, it wouldn't necessarily be mutualism, but commensalism.
right.
But it's weird
Commensalism, or even
because
I guess would it be parasitism?
it
I
is
guess one is
technically
because one is benefiting from the other.
we're not really waving our ecology flag right now very well, but yeah, no,
We've
it's
named all of the things it could be, so one of us is right at some point. So therefore, we are definitely within the realm of ecology where we name all possible possibilities and then just let the experts take the wheel on that one. So this might be edited out. You guys may never hear this, or I might look it up and find out that one of us is right, and I'll just leave it in. So if you're hearing this, good on one of us. If you're not hearing this, you'll never hear this. So, what is this like in its native habitat? Well, I just so happen to live there. Somewhat surprisingly, though, common milkweed is naturally pretty aggressive throughout its native range. Historically, common milkweed was present throughout the eastern United States and southern Canada, but has since extended its range significantly further north and west up into more polar regions, and also, of course, westward in the US. Even in its true native range, it can be fairly aggressive. And when I used to be a contracted restoration ecologist, some contracts actually had special clauses that discuss the management of common milkweed because its presence often reduced overall forb diversity. And it was just in general, it's fairly aggressive. But I will discuss more about that management later on. But it is worth noting that there are clauses within its native range where it is managed and it is an undesirable plant. So that does add a little bit more fuel to the fire about the native invasive species argument. And don't you worry, I will get real deep into that later.
for anybody who's not super familiar with ecology, welcome to the gray area. That is everything that is ecology. Things do not fit into boxes as much as we try to. When we do these analysis and things, we do have to try to fit them. But here we're looking at this really interesting species, I guess, right? Where you're saying it's native, but maybe needs to be controlled. And I know you're going to talk more about it later, but just a little note that this is something that we have to deal with a lot as biologists, that things aren't always so black and white and clear. And this is kind of to the range extension. This is that sort of neo-native we kind of mentioned in the introduction, but I'll let you break it down. I just popping in
I
here.
actually have in parentheses on here neo-native. Let Kirsten cover that part. So I think, and by cover that I mean just reference that fact. So you've got that. You spent plenty of time with me, so you know where my mind is at. The key point that I want to address is that this species of milkweed, as well as many others within the Asclepias genus, are being given out as free seeds to help populate and establish monarch breeding areas. So you've got a lot of people with fantastic intentions putting these seeds out for monarch butterfly conservation, which is more or less absolutely great. Flagship species are very important to conservation. However, because of this, management of milkweed is very difficult, not just because management is difficult, but because people will lose their minds if they see dead milkweed. So remember that if you ever get native plant species, native pollinator seed packs, or any sort of seeds that are given to you, make sure you look on the back of that, look at the species that are in there, and make sure they're native to where you're planting them. Because a lot of times people will send out quote unquote wildflower repollinator packets, which in all fairness is great intention, but you can end up spreading invasive species. Again, milkweed is not native to all of the US, at least not common milkweed. So if you were getting these packets for monarch repopulation purposes and you're not in the native range, then you probably shouldn't be planting these.
Right. I've seen, just as a little side note, I've seen lots of great things about pollinators too, like little infographics on Facebook and different social media about like what to plant to save the bees, which I am super, super happy to see those around. But you have to be careful with, again, making sure that that this infographic with these different species applies to your area. I'm sorry it's so complicated, but welcome to nature.
If you're really passionate about conservation and ecology and you want to do something that actually makes a difference, it's worth taking a little bit of extra time to do research and do it correctly, because otherwise you could just be exacerbating the problem. And I know that most of the listeners are fully aware of this and they do their research, and I have plenty of you who approach me on a daily basis saying, I do a ton of research and I try to look into the proper way to do things. And a lot of times people are surprised at what they learn just by doing some cursory searches. I mentioned this like roughly 2 minutes and 30 seconds ago, but I do think this episode is a good time to hit on why the general assumption that invasive species must be non-native is problematic. Now, I will say that I think this is a opinion and it is reserved for at least one, if not both, of the presenters for this podcast, and it's up to your own discretion whether or not you believe what we're trying to say here. I'm just coming to you from the background of a restoration ecologist and trying to better encompass and explain invasive species appropriately so that there's not misinterpretations or miscommunications between what is and what isn't an invasive species. Obviously, the assumption here is that we are referring to species that have been introduced to places outside of their native range. But as I've just stated, this doesn't account for species that are prolific within their native range and can still cause detrimental effects. Whether it is aesthetic changes or reduced biodiversity, I find it hard-pressed to not make an argument for common milkweed to be considered invasive within its native range. It just may be less aggressive inside of its native range than outside, but if a species requires extensive management and control to allow more biodiversity to flourish, even in its native habitat, then is it not considered invasive to the historic floristic community? That's a question for you to decide. To expand upon that, without human intervention, a prolific species is spreading naturally and is therefore not invasive, just successful. So that's an important distinction to make. However, with increased reproductivity of certain native species due to human disturbances and interference, certain species are able to proliferate above natural levels and can be detrimental to ecosystems, thus requiring their management via thinning or culling. So, to make that as clear as I possibly can, if a species is naturally really aggressive and historically is good at colonizing areas and being more dominant in those areas, it is not invasive. However, if a plant in its native range becomes more aggressive and dominant because of disturbances caused by humans, then I believe that that species can be classified as invasive but native. Did that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay.
And I can see the argument there. And the thing that we're looking at here, so invasive species are almost always defined as something that has been introduced and is taking over a habitat. But So maybe not introduced, but it's something that through anthropogenic means is becoming a problem, right? So I mean, even I can't think of an exact example right now, but if you have something that due to climate changes is and like warmer temperatures or wetter temperatures or drier temperatures that is taking over and the other things aren't able to survive, then that's arguably invasive as well. So, I mean, definitions, again, welcome to the gray zone where everything is a little bit tricky,
This
but
is the gray zone.
well, that could have been that could have been a good name.
Vote now if you want us to change our name by episode 5.
I veto
I'm
that.
not making another logo. We were stuck here.
No, but yeah, it's a really interesting point. So bear with us and come along for the ride. And anybody listening that does follow us on Instagram, like go ahead and let us know what you think.
Yeah, we are not going to be upset if you disagree with us. You can provide us with examples that state otherwise, including the official definition of what an invasive species is, which is introduced in its non-native range. So if you go by that, we're wrong and we're just talking out our butts. But I would like to say right here and now that I think if there is an anthropogenic influence on species and it causes for an unnatural evolution of their reproduction or establishment, then it can be an invasive species.
Right? I mean, the argument's
Yeah.
there. So how about you take us through a little bit more and see if you
Yeah,
can
you could.
convince
I
anybody that's
say it.
not convinced.
I say don't at me, but this time at me. Like tell me, and maybe we'll even talk about this in like a bonus episode or something where we discuss whether or not you guys think an invasive species must be non-native.
Or we can do a
Um,
live and see if Nicholas will cry.
Spoiler alert, I will. Sensitive. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that I personally do not manage common milkweed and encourage its establishment by spreading seeds throughout my natural areas. I believe that the potential negative effects on biodiversity and aesthetics are far outweighed in this specific scenario by the need for monarch reproduction and conservation. So essentially, rather than remove a few milkweeds from my natural areas for aesthetic purposes or to let a little bit more species diversity form, I would much rather sacrifice that species diversity and aesthetics for the benefit of additional monarch habitat. So this is pretty interesting. A study published in 2017 discussed how populations within natural areas have remained relatively consistent. That is to say, populations of milkweed, whereas agricultural populations of common milkweed have drastically declined. This study cites a 68% decline of monarch available milkweed in agricultural areas, which is insane. That is insane. And I also realize that that does not necessarily hold as much water to the argument I just made about milkweed being prolific and spreading. But again, this is specifically between agricultural areas and natural areas. Agricultural areas being cited as one of the most important areas for monarch reproduction and pollination and things like that, because most of their population or most of their range, at least in the Midwest, has been taken over by agriculture. So these roadside places where milkweed grows really well, because again, it is a very aggressive plant and it does well on roadsides, is a great way to break up that habitat fragmentation caused by the agriculture in the first place. So if we're trying to really preserve their populations, then obviously we need to start looking at those roadsides and things like that and making sure we're preserving those populations as well. So as a migratory species that reproduces 4 to 5 times over migration, if there's not a lot of flower abundance outside of natural areas, then there's probably going to be some species decline. That just makes sense. Of course, I am being facetious when I say some species decline, and I'm sure most of you are very well aware of the absolutely massive decline in monarch populations over the last few years. So for those of you who don't know, monarchs make a massive migration, which I think is pretty common knowledge. In this time, it is not a single individual that makes this migration. There is actually 4 to 5 generational life cycles that take to make this migration. So if one individual doesn't make it, 4 subsequent generations do not make it for the most part, for all intents and purposes of this argument. So essentially, if you have super fragmented habitat and things like that, and they don't have a lot of places to stop, to breed, to repopulate, and replenish their energy, then you're going to have species decline, which obviously we're seeing. As everybody knows, I think it's the Western monarch that declined like 95% in like a year or something ridiculous like that. Statistics will be in the show notes on that one because I do want to make sure I get the statistics correct on that. I'm going to also not so subtly slide in one more statistic into the mix for you without drawing any personal conclusions. And I'm going to allow you as a listener to make assumptions and do more research on your own. So, a study published in 2016 discusses how glyphosate usage in the US has drastically increased. 2/3 of all glyphosate sprayed from 1974 to 2014, which is 40 years, was sprayed in just the last 10 years.
Coincidence? I think not!
So, where is it currently invasive? Milkweed has been introduced to various places in Eurasia, including Japan, Austria, Croatia, France, Germany, Hungary, Moldova, the Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Serbia, Slovenia, Spain, and Sweden. While it has been introduced into these areas, it is only classified as particularly invasive in Serbia and Hungary. So for reference, it's not necessarily something that's managed within the other areas. It could be that there is not studies done on those other countries and the impacts. So I would say that would be a little bit of a caveat that could probably be researched more, but I felt like it wasn't worth adding any additional information to this because, as you will find out, I have done excessive amounts of information on this specific or amounts of research on this specific topic, probably too much. I am going milkweed crazy over here. It's like the Mad Hatters back in the day where they go crazy from mercury or whatever. And I'm just over here, like, just in a field of milkweed, just like losing my mind.
Have you been licking the milkweed, Nicholas?
I lost my mind. I've lost my mind. You haven't found it, have you?
I'm not going to confirm nor deny that.
Data deficit.
Right, yeah. So why was common milkweed introduced? So common milkweed was grown as an ornamental plant for years. Again, we mentioned it's pretty. The giant umbels and flowers are pretty. Obviously, I see it as a less aesthetic thing, and around here in the Midwest and throughout its native range, because it's so prolific, it's not necessarily seen that way. But again, a lot of the plants that we use as ornamentals, and by we, I'm specifically speaking for the Midwest here, are probably not seen as very beautiful within their native habitats. It's an exotic thing. We always think that things that we don't get to see on a daily basis are very pretty, and a lot of times we sacrifice our own interests and miss out on the beauty that is right in our own backyard. So it's super easy to grow. As I've mentioned, that's part of the reason why it's invasive, and it has an adaptability to non-native soil types, which basically make it an ideal ornamental to display for its large, pretty flowers and the fact that it grows super easy. Due to its high reproductivity, it quickly spread, like many ornamentals tend to do. Most of the woodland invasive species that I manage are escaped ornamentals. That's a trend that you'll probably see in more of the plant episodes as we get into that. I'm just going to quickly touch on genetically modified cultivars. Many species of cultivars that are used because they are very pretty, hardy, or for any other number of reasons that people like to use them, they are either made to lack reproductive potential or rendered sterile through genetically modified means. So if that's the case, then why are there so many escaped cultivars? Well, if I'm going to use common milkweed as a specific example, the first documented use of milkweed as an ornamental in the Netherlands dates back to 1866, which, as you would imagine, is well before our understanding of genetics and, of course, well before our understanding of invasive species and the detriments that moving one species to another can have on our native ecosystems. So you can't fault the people for bringing it over in the first place because it's pretty and we just didn't have that knowledge. It's one of those things where it's like, yes, humans were the cause of it, but you can't hold somebody specifically at fault for it because it's not like they were intentionally trying to disrupt ecosystems. We just didn't have that knowledge at the time. Actually, I think this is a good time to probably take a break. I think we're about the halfway point. So when we come back, we're going to start talking about what the issues are, some of the management strategies, and we're also going to throw a little bit of information about monarchs into the mix because I don't think you can properly talk about milkweed without addressing monarchs. So we'll see you soon. Thank you for joining us for the first half of this episode of The Anthropocene. We're going to take a short break.
The Anthropocene is an independent project by young ecologists hoping to educate and share interesting information about introduced species around the world. If you'd like to help us by sponsoring an episode, check out the links in the show notes.
And welcome back.
Hello,
Hope
everybody.
you enjoyed that break. Yeah, hope you enjoyed that break. Hope you guys got some food,
Refreshments?
some water. Yeah, I hope you're feeling refreshed. I took a quick dip in the jacuzzi that I have out back, and then that's not true. It's like 20 degrees here right now. It's incredibly cold. I wish I had a jacuzzi. But yeah, we're back, and we're back to discuss the issues. Kirsten, I guess the first thing I'm gonna pose to you as a question is, do you have any questions so far? Because I know I've been kind of rifling this off really fast, and I want to just make sure that if there's anything that I should clarify or something you think I should talk about a little bit more in depth, or if you want more information on, I not only did I do extensive research on this, but I do have a lot of experience with this in a personal background as well.
Well, so far, if I can recap and make sure I'm on the right page, because, sometimes we think we know what's going on and we don't. So essentially, milkweed, it's in its native range where we're talking about, invasive in a couple places. It's a beautiful ornamental. Humans like shiny things that aren't in our home. The grass is always greener on the other side.
Big balls!
And yeah, we have this really successful, I think it prefers to be called instead of aggressive. No, successful plant that's taking over its own range and other ranges, but it's important for monarchs, which are crashing. And also, ladies and gentlemen, took a quick peek, and it looks like the Western monarch is up to possibly 99% decline since the 1980s. So that is some sad news to be bringing your way, but that was the statistic there.
I'm going to just run another statistic by everyone really quick. For those of you who don't know, I am in northern Illinois. Illinois being the prairie state, we have 0.01% of our remaining historic prairie left in this state. The rest has been used for agriculture. Being that milkweed likes to grow in these wetter prairies and things like that, as you'd imagine, there's probably a drastic decline in monarch populations following World War II after we developed almost all of Illinois. And a lot of other, of course, Midwestern states are used for agricultural due to our high soil fertility from the glacial periods and things like that. So that is our bad, I guess, if I'm speaking on the whole of the Midwest. But I'm really trying to make up for the whole of the Midwest by slowly restoring stuff and doing science communication. So I guess I'm taking the full responsibility of the decline of monarch populations, as it turns out.
Well, this is where people are really trying to do in urban centers and stuff to focus to try to plant some of these things like milkweed and create little refuges for these type of organisms, like this example monarch, like within the city. So maybe there will be a snippet episode on urban ecosystems helping out little pollinators. We'll take a look at that.
And you just brought up a really good point that I don't address, is that conservation of this species, monarchs being the species I'm talking about, could be significantly easier because they're migratory. Obviously, that does promote or present other sort of, restrictions and things like that in their conservation. But the fact that they move and that they're small and can utilize small natural areas to their benefit could help preserve them, because it's much easier to establish these small areas and reestablish areas that they can effectively use versus like a for example, just a population of salamanders that's very unique to one location and can't necessarily be preserved or established somewhere else. So, what are the issues? So, I guess this is me speaking from the perspective of an ecologist in its native range. Common milkweed, as you'd expect from the name, has a very high reproductive potential. So, the one thing I didn't describe about these plants is their seed pods, which may in fact be the most unique part of them. So they have these large teardrop shaped pods that are covered in like soft spikes on the outside. So imagine like the typical teardrop shape that you draw, except the bottom circular spherical portion of the teardrop is what's attached to the plant via a stalk.
So it's like upside down, like an upside down teardrop.
Yeah, it's like an upside down teardrop, although
Okay,
it does stick out more horizontally than like vertically.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And then it's got these like, you could almost call them like little papillae. The only thing that I can reference off the top of my head, which is maybe even more obscure, is the inside of a sea turtle's mouth that predominantly feeds on jellyfish, where they have the fingers and papillae to help move the jellyfish down the throat. But that might just complicate things. If you were to imagine like little spiky hairs kind of over them with a fair amount of distance between them. So like a balding, spiky haired person.
To me straight, I don't know what you're even talking about. Nope.
Okay, or like
Boy, I'm just really
like
painting
a hedgehog,
pictures today.
maybe.
You know what? Yeah, kind of. Yeah, that would be a much more appropriate reference, and
might be an
probably
easier
better
visual.
than what nonsense I'm spouting over here in my living room. So these seed pods, they're really quite easy to remove, and they are fairly soft and surprisingly aerodynamic. Why would I bring this up? Why would I bring up that they're aerodynamic? Well, I say this because I have been beamed in the back of the head from impressive distances by certain quote unquote playful crew members. Adam, if you ever listen to this podcast, I'm looking at you. You know who you are. I know what you did. So eventually these seed pods, they split open and they reveal a mass of up to 425 seeds attached to an umbrella of fibrous hairs that catch the wind and help passively disperse the seeds. If I were to compare that to something that you will actually have a frame of reference for, imagine a scaled up version of a dandelion seed dispersal mechanism. If you've ever watched the movie A Bug's Life, where he like steps on the dandelion seed and breaks off and flies through the air, it's essentially that same mechanism. They're just combined into a pod, and the pods more or less break open once they dry out, and inside is just this like dense cluster of seeds. And then of course attached to that is like these white fluffy hairs, and it looks, if you've never seen it, I imagine it looks incredibly weird. And when you see that, a lot of people will go and they'll just take them and throw them in the air and things like that. And of course, within its native range, that's probably beneficial to the monarch populations and things like that. But as you would imagine, a successful seed dispersal mechanism is probably good at spreading an invasive species. So of course, now we're talking about outside of its native range, without anything to hinder that productivity. What do we end up with? Well, according to a study done in 2009, or a study published in 2009 by Santos et al., unmanaged fields where common milkweed was present had up to 10,000 seeds per square meter. So while species richness is shown not to be affected by the presence of milkweed, overall presence of native species individually is reduced. So to simplify that, in areas where common milkweed has established, it isn't necessarily getting rid of the native species holistically, but it is taking up spaces where they would normally grow and reducing their presence overall. So the species density is reducing, not necessarily the species biodiversity, which you could argue is just as detrimental, because if you have less of a population of a native species, it's got less reproductive potential, less resistance, and you're, of course, not necessarily reducing an individual species from being there. It's just not going to be as strong.
Right, so it's not, oh, sorry about that.
Go ahead.
It's not the case that there's some plants that definitely take over and they completely spatially exclude all other plants, but it definitely is like causing a huge reduction in the amount of, not amount of individual native species, but like the number of species.
Right. So
Okay.
to compare it to a previous episode, if you've listened to the grass episode and you're going chronologically, it would probably be the episode right before this one. Then you know that certain species will completely suffocate out and prevent other species from growing. And to an even further extent, there is, of course, allelopathy, which is an active deterrent from other species growing, which we'll probably get into in a future episode. But in the case of milkweed, it's kind of just growing there. It's just occupying some of the nutrients and some of the airspace, if you will, and preventing other plants from growing in that specific area. So it's just reducing overall presence of native species, but not removing an individual species from that habitat. Because the seeds spread by wind, they need to be fairly thin, lightweight, and simplistic, which are coincidentally all adjectives that describe the brain tissue of people who intentionally litter. Pause for
Oh.
effect. Because of this, the seeds that are spread are generally only viable for a single growing season, and they do not form any sort of seed bank in the soil. And I will go into that, but keep that in mind. As you'd imagine, if something's flying through the air, needs to travel far distances and things like that, it can't be very heavy because it's not going to be a very successful reproduction method. They have to be thin, but consequently, they can't overwinter or stay long periods of time in the soil without being broken down. So they have to germinate during that first reproductive period. And I will break this down a little bit more and the effects that that can have, which may even be beneficial to management. So a study done in 2020, so very recently, by Jarova et al., was done to determine whether or not invasive milkweed had any negative effects on the nematode communities in the natural grasslands. So this would be within the non-native range of milkweed is where this study was done. The results indicated that it did not affect nematode presence, and I'll just take a quick moment to explain what nematodes are. They're essentially fungi and bacteria eaters and also plant parasites that are incredibly small and present in soil.
They look like really tiny worms.
Right. And there's a bunch of different species and things like that. And
Right.
way above my knowledge level to go in any more depth than that. So, but yes, nematodes. For some reason, nematodes are also referred to like tadpole. People will call nematodes tadpoles. And I think that might be a local thing to the Midwest. And it might even be like a Illinois thing. But growing up, people would call the tadpoles nematodes. And I don't really know why that is. But I would be interested to see if anybody else has heard that. I want to know like how local that is. Have you ever referred to like frog larvae or anything like that other than like the soil microorganisms as nematodes? Comment to tell us.
As a response, I have a very confused and slightly judgmental look on my face, but that's my only comment.
The results indicated that the milkweed did not affect nematode presence. The general soil physiochemical properties were also unaltered in survey areas. So it's not really having like an effect as of how I've described it so far. However, it was observed that there were direct effects on the surrounding floristic community, and these are obviously negative effects. So it's not necessarily changing soil dynamics. It's not necessarily affecting the soil physiology or microbiology or anything like that. A lot of invasive species will have changes like that, which means that milkweed, although prolific and spreading very quickly and does have, negative effects, it's not as aggressive as other invasive species that we may have discussed already or will discuss in the future. That being said, it is very clear that there is a negative impact on floristic communities, which, with the relatively, I guess you could say more or less relatively new introduction of common milkweed to a lot of Eurasian places, we may see more detrimental effects in the future as this species proliferates and things like that.
Right. So at the end of the day, it's just taking up resources, and it's just maybe better at reproducing sometimes than some of the native fauna or flora.
Yes. Right now, we're going to look at the potential management strategies because I think in this instance, it's pretty important to break down both the feasibility and subsequent choosing of management strategies. we're going to talk about mechanical strategies first. So mechanical is essentially anything that doesn't use chemicals. It could be manual labor. It can be using equipment for removal and things like that. So when we're talking about mechanical methods of management for the species, if the species is cut or mechanically managed in some way to where it's damaged, common milkweed can actually clone itself, and then the multi-stem clones that result from that can produce, of course, more seed pods than on an uncut individual. So mechanical means by themselves could potentially increase the reproductivity of milkweed if done improperly. I noticed a lot of places would cite fully pulling out the plant by its root system, which is a good method for removal of invasives in many ways. But also, depending on the soil, time of year, and moisture levels, you might just rip the top of the plant off and it might not come out. And then that taproot's still down there and the plant can just clone itself from that.
So you're kind of, I don't know if anybody else is getting the sort of Hercules Hydra sort of metaphor here, where every time he cuts off a head, there's like two more and it's worse and worse. It's kind of the same idea here, a little bit.
Will you forget the head slicing thing?
So moving on past mechanical, you've also got, of course, chemical management, which is one of the main methods of treatment for a lot of invasive plant species. So if you're expanding on the chemical management, milkweed can obviously successfully clone itself after a single herbicide treatment as well. So I've experienced this firsthand, milkweed is insanely resistant to even like strong levels of glyphosate, which is a non-selective herbicide that is generally used in restoration management and things like that. That being said, if you use herbicide treatments in multiple management cycles and in quick succession, apparently it can be effectively managed. That being said, when I've done it as a contractor, which again, remember, this is in my previous life, this isn't right now. I encourage the establishment of milkweed, but when I was under contract to remove it, you would have to use a different chemical formulation with a different active ingredient that was more effective at targeting the milkweed. I think it had to be a selective broadleaf herbicide. I think it was triclopyr was the active ingredient, if I remember correctly. Although this study does show that chemical means are effective, this was done using glyphosate. And I would say that in my experience, glyphosate, even if used in multiple treatments, isn't necessarily effective. And the multiple and quick successive treatments they're referring to may be implying that it needs to be done more frequently and at higher rates than written on the herbicide label. Now, for those of you who don't know, the herbicide label is law, and you cannot exceed those limits. At least in the US, I don't know how it works for I can't speak for other countries. But if you exceed those limits, it is by law, the negative effects can come back on you and you can be charged with stuff for that. So the recommendation levels are arguably already high enough for the treatment of the plants that you're using, and it will work. It's proven to work because they wouldn't sell an herbicide to treat that plant if there wasn't a study done on the efficiency of it. So therefore, if something says it controls milkweed and you use it multiple times and it doesn't control it, you may have to exceed that level, which is obviously going to have more detrimental effects to the environment. So I would say that as a little bit of a grain of salt when they're referencing this management strategy here.
Right. I mean, it's definitely, the hope is definitely wherever you are, the herbicides that you're buying are marketed for the right things, and the quantities there are correct. And I'm sure, like, definitely in a lot of countries and places, there's really good regulations around this, but I can guarantee you that there are places that sell things that are marketed for things that they shouldn't be. But that's mostly in places where the environmental protection isn't as, what is the word I'm looking for, Nicholas?
Stringent.
Yes, stringent, exactly. So, but that's the hope.
Also, yeah, and I will also add to the fact that if you are looking into a contracted restoration company, it's totally fine and well within your rights to ask them about their management strategies and see how they do it. And also, if it's your own property or something that you're contracting them out to do, be with them when they mix the herbicide, because yes, some of them may be educated and may have read the herbicide labels, which you are supposed to do every time you purchase a product. You might get people who are exceeding limits to meet contractual obligations. They might be applying at times that are inappropriate. You need to be able to properly apply herbicide, and the testing for it is pretty strict. So if you've got a license, then you should know it. But that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that the laws and regulations are biblically followed. But what you should do is supervise, and if you're doing your own application, again, make sure you're applying it to the correct extent and within, the proper licensing and things like that and the proper chemicals. But you should do plenty of research to make sure that these chemicals can be used, because I am a firm believer that chemicals can be used safely and effectively to manage a lot of invasive species and restore ecosystems. However, I am also a strong proponent that they are used very regularly inappropriately and not with the biological community in the best interest. A lot of times contractors are in it to meet standards. Standards for these environmental contracts can be up to 99.9% removal, sometimes 100% removal of an invasive species from a contracted area. In order to achieve that and get the money in the time with the amount of crew and et cetera that is provided, some places will skirt those laws. And I'm not calling anybody out or saying that that's happened in any place I've worked at. I'm just saying that is something that does occur, and I am fully aware that it occurs. And I think that it's important that you, as a consumer or somebody who's interested in conservation, is aware that who you're contracting or paying to do this work, etc., needs to be fully aware of the implications of improperly applying these chemicals. So chemicals are a hot topic and they're very highly debated, but if done to the book in the way that they should be applied with the biological community in mind, that includes pollinators, flowers, overspray, etc., 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 it can be done properly. It just needs to be done in a very, very stringent and appropriate manner. And that is my soapbox for this episode. I will take your questions soon. I prefer if you have a standing ovation, though it isn't necessary. Send me some money so I can continue to do this, preferably in large, unmarked, sequential bills. But hey, you do you.
Okay, at the end of the day, chemicals are not always the 100% enemy, and there are ways to use them responsibly.
Right. And I think we talk about herbicide mitigation pretty thoroughly in episode 2 with the grasses. Moving on, I've talked about mechanical and chemical, and I will now, of course, talk about cultural. So the main cultural management practice that is used within the native range of this species is burning. So obviously, as these species are native to areas where persistent burning occurs, then they have a higher tolerance, making that strategy ineffective other places. So you can't obviously use a burn to get rid of a plant that is tolerant to burns. This species has also been introduced to areas where burning doesn't necessarily occur with enough frequency for the native plants in that area to have any fire resistance. So if you were to run a burn through these areas where this plant is non-native, you might encourage it to grow and then hurt the native floristic community. We've talked about in previous episodes how species that occur in burned areas are obviously more tolerant of burning. What we haven't discussed, at least not in length, is the fact that many species actually respond positively and grow better following burns. So I found a really cool study published in the Polish Journal of Ecology in 2015 by Andrea Mojes and Tibor Kalapos. I apologize if I get the names wrong. But it is called Plant-Derived Smoke Enhances Germination of the Invasive Common Milkweed. The implications of that title are just so cool to me. And I'm going to explain this study in length, but I just want to say that I had a full nerd out moment because of how applicable that was to this specific topic and how cool that is and the implications that come from it.
This is super intriguing. I know quite a bit about like pyrophilic plants, like that enjoy plants, but this is the smoke thing. This is intriguing. Show us what you got.
Oh, I'm about to get real into it. So this study was done on the response of seed germination in common milkweed after exposure to smoke, which would be present after fires. Essentially, the researchers hypothesized that the exposure from smoke Essentially, the researchers hypothesized that exposure to smoke from fire could stimulate the ending of the stratification process and encourage the germination of the plants. So when I say stratification, it's essentially the dormant period that a lot of seeds require for for proper germination rates. Higher germination rates are more responsive to a better stratification period. So it's essentially a dormant period that a lot of temperate seeds go into before they germinate. So they did this by exposing seeds to different control and smoke enhanced water. So they were able to determine that there were definitely positive responses and increases in germination rates of seeds undergoing stratification. So the seeds that were currently undergoing stratification responded positively to the smoke enhanced water, or water that was basically infused with smoke from fire.
Right.
Essentially, the seeds responded to the presence of smoke in the water as an indicator to begin germination and increase their germination rates approximately tenfold. So the authors go on to theorize that with increasing temperatures due to climate change and increased fire frequency in their non-native range, introduced species that respond well to burns could become even more prolific and aggressive following these increased fire frequencies in their non-native range.
Right. This is so cool because we definitely know that there's a lot of plants that need fire to grow. Like the really common one is like a lot of conifers like don't grow without fire. But the strategy Jack pine, exactly. Yeah, that's one of the prime examples. And it's a cool strategy because essentially as a seed after a fire, you're getting not only the benefits of one, there are less big plants taking up all the resources because they have been burned to the ground. Two, there isn't a whole bunch of leaf litter and dead stuff for you to have to push through. And three, fires leave a bunch of ash and it's just a bunch of extra nutrients. So there's all these different reasons to grow after a fire, but that's so cool that the smoke itself is what is triggering, and not only triggering the growth, but triggering a more rapid growth. I'm having like a total plant nerd out with you here right now.
It's insane. Like, I'm sure a lot of listeners probably listen for the fauna episodes and things like that because, obviously fauna sometimes are more attractive. But for the plant nerds out here, this is some hot shit, man. This is dope. I'm fired up right now. Like, oh man, that was a good pun. Wasn't even intentional.
Woo!
I'm just so excited about this.
Oh, I'm so happy I can't even feel my arm.
It's so cool. And I just want to reiterate that last statement one more time for everyone. So increased global temperatures increase how often fires happen in areas where fires are not necessarily a normal occurrence. So this could both harm native populations while allowing non-native species that respond to fire to flourish. So it's a positive feedback loop with negative effects, which is insane because it's just showing that if we don't do something about conservation and restoration and things like that, it's only going to exponentially increase in the future. So, where is it the worst? This is one we normally talk about a little bit more and we do a specific case study on, but I didn't think it was necessary because I've discussed it throughout. But essentially, where is it the worst? It's difficult to say because in its native range, it's pretty aggressive, but it obviously needs to be there. And arguably it needs to establish because it will help preserve or possibly save monarch populations. And of course, in Serbia and Hungary, it is invasive and there's no monarchs in Serbia and Hungary natively. So if you think about it that way, then that would be pretty clear cut. That would be where it's the worst. Talking about that, we're just going to go right into what is being done to control these. I actually found a technical note that is prepared by the IUCN for the European Commission that specifically outlines management strategies. But it's literally done here. This was the easiest research I've ever had to do because it literally outlines the exact ideal management strategies as of right now for the invasive populations.
Beautiful.
So the citation for this, by the way, is Lapin in 2017. And it's that technical note I had referenced. So what is primarily being done? And that is pretty much primary chemical management through glyphosate. However, many studies indicate direct negative effects from glyphosate, both on applicators and the environments. I'm not going to take the time to talk to you about glyphosate. You can do your own research. You probably know about glyphosate, and you probably will learn more about it in coming episodes. Because of this negative impacts, many countries in the European Union are banning or have banned products containing the active ingredient glyphosate. As you imagine, this could have negative effects on the management strategies if the primary chemical removal method is glyphosate. So that might mean new chemicals need to be developed. There might be chemicals that are not as effective as removing them, etc. That's just something that I wanted to put in there because of the increasing societal resistance to glyphosate. I personally believe glyphosate will not be around in most countries in the next 20 years, even the US included, especially with all of the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma correlations that are popping up with this chemical. The list that I mentioned specifically discusses a ban on keeping, importing, selling, breeding, and growing common milkweed. So that's preventative measures right there. They're trying to prevent the additional spread, which is a very important conservation method in invasive species removal, because if you're just trying to eradicate something, but it's still being imported for other means, then there's always going to be an increased supply of reproductive plants. So it goes on to discuss how selective spraying of herbicides can be used in tandem with early stage mechanical management of the plant as essentially the most effective control methods. Again, we talked about herbicide mitigation in a previous episode, but just to go over it very briefly, if you use herbicide mitigation methods, then you are using chemical treatments, but you are supplementing overall chemical usage with mechanical, cultural, biological, and other methods to help reduce the amount of pesticides that you're using. And also, a multi-pronged attack can actually be more effective than just using more of one type of management strategy.
Give him the old 1-2.
All right, kid. Give him the old 1-2.
So there is some differentiation between agricultural and public and natural lands, which is something to bring up, is that this list does differentiate between treatment strategies between agricultural and the natural lands, which, as we discussed before, there is importance in agricultural usage of these plants for monarchs. However, as you'd imagine, in their non-native range, where they establish quickly in agricultural areas, it could be more prolific. So chiefly, this discusses the drawbacks for either agricultural or public natural lands, such as mechanical management in non-cropland areas, which disturbs the soil and invites the establishment of invasives. So any mechanical management that you use, for the most part, that's going to be effective against the treatment of this plant is going to disturb the soil. And when soil is disturbed, invasive species will more readily establish in that disturbed soil. So you could be effectively making it worse, which is why mechanical means by itself are not necessarily the best methods. Or chemical, because for the same reason. If you use chemicals and you devoid the soil of life, then there's a disturbance there, and then the invasives can quickly establish. This is actually a really good point to address, especially at this point. We'll probably talk a lot about primary and secondary succession when it comes to invasive plants. We've discussed it a little bit, and I may have done an oopsie and mislabeled what a technical primary successor is, or used it improperly in a previous episode, because there tends to be a little bit of misuse of the terminology for reasons I will explain. Primary succession is essentially when an area is completely devoid of life is finally able to develop and sustain a biotic community. Secondary succession is when an area is colonized after a massive disturbance, but it was already previously colonized. So both primary and secondary successors are going to be plants that are very adaptable, tolerant, and quick to germinate and reproduce. However, true primary succession only happens in areas that have been truly unoccupied. So for a very specific example, think new islands formed by lava, the creation of a new oxbow in a river from a silt deposit, areas that have never been previously colonized or supported a biotic community for one reason or another. Secondary succession happens after any form of disturbance. So even in situations where an area has been completely mowed, tilled, etc., it is technically correct to refer to the first species that grow back, which are generally weeds and they're generally invasive, as secondary successors, which can sound a bit counterintuitive without context because we're rarely talking about true primary succession, but I feel
Right.
like a lot of the time people will say those primary successors that come in after a disturbance. But in reality, secondary successors come in after a disturbance. Primary successors are the first things to establish in a newly colonizable area.
Right, and those tend to be mosses and lichens and things that grow on rock and don't necessarily
Right.
grow on soil or in super
Your
difficult.
less complicated plants.
Right, exactly. Yes, some very technical and super strict terminology, which is good. It's good that we definitely try to
Right.
break it down exactly the right way we can. But long story
That
short, we're almost always talking about secondary succession.
Right. And
Yeah.
you would be forgiven if you use primary succession after a disturbance or something like that, because I think that like if you could argue that a large enough disturbance renders an area devoid of life and therefore would be primary succession, blah, 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 blah. But for all intents and purposes, when we reference secondary succession, we are talking about the first plants that colonize after a disturbance. So that is a little counterintuitive. I just wanted to hit on that and touch on that. And I can reference back to this episode in the future when I undoubtedly make the mistake again. So before we mentioned that the species doesn't necessarily occupy a seed bank, remember when I talked about the very thin seeds that float through the air and they don't have a lot of longevity as far as living in the soil? Because of the fact that they need to establish the year they are produced, one effective method for species reduction may be simply collecting seed pods before they open and disperse seeds. This would fall under a mechanical control method and wouldn't require any herbicide or plant destruction. Plants would still be able to effectively house and feed milkweed dependent species. The only drawback would likely be reduced populations in the immediate area. So let me break this down into the subsequent effects of this, both in the native and the non-native habitat. In the native habitat, if you are trying to reduce milkweed populations, a really effective way of doing that would be to pluck out all of the seed pods before they germinate. There is a pretty long period of time before they are viable seeds. And if you were to just put those in a bucket and bury them somewhere or burn them, then they would be non-viable and they wouldn't establish, and then those plants would not be able to reproduce, and therefore you would not get any more plants in that area and would reduce genetic diversity, which could be beneficial on an aesthetic means in its native habitat. However, the drawback to that would be that you would have reduced populations in the immediate vicinity of those milkweeds that you are removing the seed pods from, which therefore would mean there is less habitat for monarchs within its native range. The antithesis of that is if you do this in the non-native habitat, you are preventing that plant from becoming reproductive and establishing again, and you're not creating a disturbance for those secondary successors, which could just be more milkweed.
Right.
However, the drawback to that, of course, is that you are still leaving plants there. And the management for that would be pretty strenuous and extensive. Now, remember, we said there was like 10,000 seeds per square meter in some of these areas, which means the plant density of milkweed is very thick. There can be a lot of pods on a milkweed plant. And if you're going around pulling those sticky boys off, you're going to have a real fun time afterwards, cleaning yourself up and It's going to take you a while and it's a lot of effort. However, the drawbacks may be outweighed by the potential benefits. So that's something to consider. I didn't see any papers on that. That's just my own 2 cents. And that's how I would manage it in a more effective and appropriate manner personally.
Right. You'd have to look into resources and see how much it would, like, just man hours and stuff. I think it could be pretty substantial, but hard to say. That's something to look into.
Right. Yeah. And it depends. If you're at a place like a conservation district or something like that, where all of the money is dedicated to doing things the best management practice and to do it not necessarily most efficiently, but with the least amount of negative effects in mind, then that might be a viable option for those particular people. It just depends on who's doing it and where you're at. Because if you're doing it in the native versus non-native, arguably it's just better just let them grow. So
right.
Lastly, we're going to talk about, are the control methods affecting native biodiversity? So, of course, the most important thing that I want to highlight and that everybody is thinking about is that monarch butterflies are not native in Europe. They are not native in Europe. Therefore, the management in these invasive areas does not influence monarch populations. So if somebody were to be like, well, if you're managing milkweed, then it'll be less monarchs. They do not occur in the Eurasian invasive populations. Therefore, their management, whatever they're doing, is not affecting monarchs. So keep that in mind. It is, however, obviously affecting other species that have decided to use those as maybe pollinators, because I don't believe the flowers themselves are toxic and things like that. There are species over there that have adapted to utilize milkweed to some degree. So those species might be affected, but as far as monarchs, not affected. However, any management done on species mitigation within their native range can have very direct adverse effects and indirect adverse effects on monarch populations. If you're removing their host plant from their native range, regardless of the intentions of it, there is less food, less reproductive areas, less support for monarchs. So anything that you do will have a negative effect on the population to some degree. So that's something to remember. So yes, management strategies within their native range is having an adverse effect on native populations. I would like to bring up a very specific thing here on glyphosate, because I did mention earlier that I wanted you to think about that statistic I mentioned with glyphosate increasing in agricultural uses over the last 10 years exponentially. So currently, there is no supporting evidence that glyphosate usage has an indirect effect on monarch populations. Notice I said indirect, because if you spray a monarch or a caterpillar or the eggs with glyphosate, that's a direct effect.
Okay.
So I am specifically referencing indirect effects, meaning like what you would see with bees and things like that, like colonial collapse disorder, that come from the secondary effects of herbicide. And why is that? Because glyphosate is not a neonicotinoid herbicide. We will probably go into neonicotinoid herbicides in the future, but those are the ones that are correlated directly to having negative effects on monarch and other insect populations. Neonicotinoids, for clarification, are linked to negative impacts on invertebrates. However, glyphosate is not a neonicotinoid herbicide. Therefore, it is not linked in with that group. So glyphosate is considered to be non-detrimental indirectly to monarch populations. However, the increased use of glyphosate on agricultural fields, being that it has increased significantly within the last years, could directly be affecting the roadside populations of milkweed due to overspray, leaching through the soils, anything like that, which could be creating less habitat for food and reproduction for monarchs. This study has not been done. I am taking 2 studies and just iterating a correlation, which is not something you should do in science. You should not do this. I am just saying, as a hypothesis and nothing more, that if we are using more glyphosate in the US and we are using it higher in agricultural fields, which are important for the reproductivity and food sources of monarchs, and that negative impact is reducing milkweed presence in these areas, then there may be declines in monarch populations that come from the uses of glyphosate. However, it is not because of the chemical makeup of them. It is because of the removal of their habitat and food sources.
Right. So there's a lot of different herbicides that are causing like essentially health issues in insects, right? That's the easiest way to put it. But this one isn't one of them. And obviously
There are no studies to show that.
or no studies to show that that's a problem. But yeah, at the end of the day, we're really just looking at the land use change and the loss of the habitat and perhaps some leaching and some other stuff, but we're not sure. If anybody knows anybody studying this, maybe in grad school or as a lab, let us know.
Yeah, comment below. I don't know where below is, but just DM us or something. I don't know. I don't know how social media works. I'm old. So I'm pretty much wrapping up right now, but I do want to highlight a couple things before we get to the debate round. As of now, because I don't want people going out there right now and being like, "Oh, Nature Nerd Nicholas, that guy, he said that monarch populations are because of glyphosate. Glyphosate's bad. It's killing all the monarchs." That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it could be having a negative effect on them. However, most studies will reference and cite the habitat loss and climate change as the main factors for the drastic decline in monarch populations. Some of these will be cited below in the show notes. Specifically, they are citing both decline in overwintering habitat in Mexico as well as decline in milkweed habitat throughout their migratory range. Now you can take that information and use it with the other information I said to draw conclusions. I don't want you guys going out and making your own conclusions. I just want you to hear the facts that we've stated today and understand that, one, there is a decline in monarch populations. Two, I am not saying that glyphosate has a direct effect on that. There are just correlations with increased glyphosate usage and declines in monarch. But you could probably say there is a correlation between the decline of frosted tips in the US and monarch population declines. Therefore, if more people were to frost their tips in the US, monarch populations would rise. As a very comedic example.
It's an intervention. The tips have to go.
What? Why?
Jake, we're worried about you and you look very stupid.
Come on, guys. I think they're kind of cool. Retro.
No, they're terrible.
I want you guys to know that correlation does not mean causation. So everything that I'm saying here is to be taken with a grain of salt. Each individual study is an individual study. This is a synthesis of multiple studies, and I don't want anybody going out and thinking that I am drawing conclusions or giving any sort of weight to an unsupported, unresearched means of decline for monarch populations.
Okay.
On
Yes, sir.
one last good note, because I don't want to end on just me saying don't listen to me. I could be wrong. I want to end on a light note, and I want to say that the potential for increasing monarch populations is there, being that they're host plants. One, there's many different species of milkweeds. I hardly talked about any. There's butterfly swamp. We could go on for a long time. However, common milkweed proliferates great. Monarchs love it. They don't necessarily choose one. They're not preferential. If anything, they're probably more uncommon milkweed because it's generally more common than the other ones. Oh, imagine that. We are telling you the big facts here.
Wow.
So therefore, if it's establishing quickly and it's a plant that grows quickly, we have a lot of viable seeds for them. We can collect seeds easily. We can get it to establish. It grows in disturbed areas, et cetera, et cetera. We have the means to establish monarch habitat. And we mentioned we can do it in urban areas. We can do it in fragmented habitat. We can do it on roadsides and things like that. We could have more native roadsides with pollinator populations and things. And we'll probably talk about that in the future. There are negative drawbacks to having pollinator populations next to roadsides because of car collisions and things of that. However, probably any habitat is better than no habitat. So we have the means for repopulation of monarch habitat, and we have a species that's willing to do it pretty much in areas that other plants wouldn't grow. So I'm not saying that everything is hopeless. Obviously, we cited a 99% decline in Western monarch populations, which is very disheartening and kind of soul crushing. However, if we really want to do proper conservation of this species, I think it's important to realize that we need to have some hope, and you can make a difference if you're within the native range. Monarch and pollinator gardens are vital to the conservation of this species. If you're ever sitting at home and like, what can I do? Like, I don't know what I could do. You can plant a few milkweed plants and it can be beneficial. And of course, as I've mentioned like 6 or 8 times now, make sure you're in the native range of those milkweed. But if you are, plant a couple milkweed. They grow pretty easily. You can usually find them on roadsides and things like that in the Midwest, and I'm sure throughout their native range. Do your research, learn about them, and have a direct positive impact on the monarch populations. That's all I've got, except for the debate round.
The debate round. Let's go. All right, so there's not a whole lot either to cover because you did a really great job of breaking it all down, and I think you really played the devil's advocate for yourself a couple times and then jumped back, but
that's a really nice way of saying I just talked far too much.
No. Oh, no. Okay, so we're really been drilling into everybody's head about native range, and if you're in the native range, then it's good to keep proliferating it and help the monarchs. But is there not a random population now of monarchs in Spain on the population of not invasive but introduced non-native milkweed? And should we not just let them be over there? Then is that not a good thing?
Well, I can honestly say that is not something that I can factually support or deny. This is up to the opinion of people. So, this is a principle that has been introduced significantly over the last years. There is a population of monarch butterflies established in Spain on the non-native milkweed. They are doing fairly well. And arguably, you could use that to help reestablish their populations. Counter-arguably, would that have a negative impact on the native biodiversity of Spain? It might. Do the costs and benefits outweigh one another? That's not necessarily for me to say. Therefore, this principle of taking a species that is in decline within its native range and repopulating it within an area where it has established that is outside of its native range is a very new and very controversial topic. It's not one that I personally support. I think that we should continue to do our best to preserve the natural ecosystems because we don't necessarily know the effects of large scale just switching over ecosystems. You can't just take an ecosystem and say, these plants have established here, let's establish these insects here, then let's establish these frogs here, then et cetera, et cetera. That could completely collapse an ecosystem, and it could even collapse the invasive ecosystem as well, and then you're completely devoid of life.
No, and I think like a big issue with this is that the immediate effects look great and look fine, but a lot of things that are invasive, like you said, they were established so long ago, but it takes time for them to become a problem. So we don't know what problems we're causing down the road, I guess.
Right. And could you technically, I don't know if monarchs are the best example of this, but could you technically remove the invasive species from this non-native habitat and put them back in their native habitat is also an argument that's made. And I would say that the diseases, parasites, and the ecosystems are different enough that if you move one from another, you could introduce not necessarily a visible invasive species, but a parasite or a disease or something like that, that the invasive population may be tolerant to, but the native population may not be. So this is why you don't see populations of invasive Burmese pythons removed from the Everglades and then taken over to Southeast Asia, because some of the immune system functions and additional potential parasites or things like that could be insanely detrimental to the populations over in Southeast Asia.
Right. This is like
Therefore,
super complicated.
right. So there are processes where it could work. Theoretically, you could remove them from the wild and then quarantine them, make sure that they're removed of parasites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whatever. However, that is not a topic that I think we're capable of discussing. I think more research needs to be done on that. And I think that I'm speaking for myself here, but I'm firmly oriented and we should do our best to conserve the native ecosystems as best to our knowledge historically what they used to be.
Right.
Therefore, utilizing a alien population, for lack of a better term, to reestablish a declining population within its native range, as of currently, is not a viable solution for species conservation. And with that, I think we've wrapped up this episode. I know this was a lot, and I'm sorry, but I hope that you guys found this as interesting as I did. I know it's 2 episodes in a row about plants. God forbid we did a third. We never do that. But let us know. Are you guys interested in this? Because we love it. And I love researching things like this. I love talking about plants, probably more than most people. But I just think that things like this are so interesting, and there's something that really does need to be discussed if we properly talk about conservation. So that's all that I have for you guys. And I want to say thank you for listening if you made it to the end here. And we hope to see you next time.
Right. Appreciate the plants. We also have a pretty cool fauna episode for you next time, just in case. So hang tight. Thanks so much, everybody. See you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Anthropocene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover.